Hello, hello. Yeah, it's been a while. I've, like I mentioned last time, I was chatting to other people from the philosophy forum, but I didn't record any of the discussions I've had because they didn't want them recorded, so fair enough. Um, but yeah, hopefully in the future, there's definitely one guy who will be up for doing it, who's I think he's like a, what do you call it, assistant professor or something in New Zealand. But anyway, get into that another day. Um, Other than that, yeah, I'll leave a link to the Substack. I've got a little bit of an essay there, which I'm gonna. Well, it's already up. It's been up a while, but it's gonna be a follow up to that as well. Sort of following the topic of boredom, which is covering the first one I've posted already, which is just goes over one of Schopenhauer's ideas a little bit, and the next one I'm gonna go into the Korean guy, Bung Chul, whatever his name is, who I did a little sketch of. Just finished doing the sketch. I'm trying to do sketches for each one. This guy, if you recognize the face or not. His nose is a bit long, but whatever. It is what it is. I tried to teach Schopenhauer. This is funny. I was going to put one up for Schopenhauer, but it was so bad. Oh dear. Oh dear. That cracked me up. But yeah, usually the first one I do is terrible, and I just erase it and then do it again, and it's okay. But I just wasn't in the flow on the old Showpay, so definitely going to cover him again at some point. So I do want then. Anyway, what do I want to ramble about now? Well, I was talking about the God concept last time, and I'm going to sort of maybe circle around to that a little bit. Um, well, yeah, kind of covering roughly the same sort of idea, sort of talking about the idea of the God. Oh, I should turn this line up, Jesus. Yet, how do I put this into words that make sense? Give me a minute, my God. Mm. Mm. Retard with coffee. Oh yeah, the discussions I had with the two guys from the forum were yeah pretty good, pretty cool. Yeah, one in particular, he's writing something. I might throw that in the link. I guess he wouldn't mind, but yeah, I'll ask him about that. Maybe next video I'll do something about that. He's doing something along the lines of looking at human experience and consciousness and trying to articulate what that means in his own very particular analytic philosophical sense. I think he's been extremely overambitious to say the least. I think he needs to break it down. But you know, we'll see. We'll see. It's his thing. It's his stuff. Maybe it's a bit too dense for me in a way because he's throwing his own terminology here and there, which I understand does need to be done sometimes. But I was suggesting to him do a comparison with some other philosophers. It seems a little bit archaic the style he's writing. But anyway, yeah, in the future, I've offered these kind of criticisms to him already, but he's just doing his thing, I guess, working it out. And it's yeah, it looks interesting. I might do a video on that in the future, but it's a weird one. Anyway, now I bring him up because he was mentioning selfhood, as in that's one of his topics that's coming up, and he's sort of anyway. Let's just jump into this idea again. This is a very common one. The the dualism with Descartes. I'm sure anyone who's interested in philosophy would know about this, as in the the spiritual world, the physical world kind of thing. My own particular sort of preference when we're talking about this kind of topic is to jump straight into the phenomenological perspective, which is basically to say that experiences exist. Whether they're real or not is irrelevant to me. If I hallucinate seeing a tiger flying through the sky, then that's what I saw. Doesn't mean it's there. It's irrelevant whether it's there. So it's more about taking on sort of the Hertzelian perspective of it when he was trying to create his own science of consciousness. which is basically to look at the experience and to examine what contents these experiences have. And the guy I was just talking about, who's done this thing on the forum and he's writing his stuff, again, he's taking on a bit of a Buddhist perspective. I'm not very clear exactly what his view is, but yeah, we'll find out in the future. But yeah, it's well, not Buddhist perspective, the Buddhist kind of philosophy, the way of looking at the idea of self and such, which is very similar to people like Sartre, Heidegger, and whatnot as well. So it's all outside the realms of woo-woo. But it's whether it's going to have much fruitful is going to come from that, who knows? But personally, I found the phenomenological perspective on things interesting, as in it's just, I view it as a kind of skepticism in a way, where it's you, like, even though you know certain things are real, you just sort of, well, just because I'm seeing it like that, then is it really like that? Is that how everyone's seen it? Is there enough way I can look at it? And this is something that Husserl himself would try and challenge people to do, to basically look at the obvious and question it. And I think it's a good, healthy way to take things. Obviously, if you go too far with it, then welcome to the land of woo-woo, I imagine. Yeah, anyway, I'm trying to think what, if I refer to selfhood, I'm not quite sure what that would mean, because it's very contextual, the term. But in terms of like neuroscience, talking about the self, what does that mean? And I was mentioning a term to him they use in the cognitive neurosciences, which is the authorship of an action. Whereas it's quite easy for people to claim authorship of an action they have no actual activity in. An example might be, well, there's an experiment where they have one person has their finger and underneath, one person has their finger on top, and you press the button when it's the correct answer or whatever pops up on the screen. If the person on top presses the button and the person below does not, and they have they have devices on to measure like whether they were going to do it or not, whether they thought it was a correct answer or not. So they can see what the person's thinking. They know whether they think, oh, it's wrong. But when the other person presses it and it turns out to be right, what then happens is they will claim authorship over the action the other person made. They will say, oh, I pressed it, if it's advantageous to them, which is a really interesting thing. And I was mentioning them to the guys chatting with about in psychology. I think there's Jung who talks about a particular instance of this, where there's a woman he sends into he's doing some kind of hypnosis on her, and for some reason, because of what was happening, and he was talking to some part of her psyche, and like then when she come round back into the room, like really there with him, and she had this umbrella up in the room, and he asked her like, why is the umbrella up? And she on the spot creating a story as to why she put her umbrella up, which she believed, and it was not true, because during the trance she had done something, and the reason she put the umbrella up was because of that. There was something that was happening in her psyche, that she had some kind of hallucination or something. Whereas when she was consciously aware of what was going on, she then made up a story to explain it and believed it, which is an extremely interesting and peculiar thing to think about. And it then throws up the question, you think, oh yeah, she was in a trance, it's a different state, but we don't know when we go into these kind of states, the altered states of consciousness. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. So what is to say that a lot of what happens and what we claim authorship over is actually us, the self, doing it? And again, very tricky term to use here with self, which is why I understand the guy you was just chatting about. He made up his own term for this thing within us, and but within anyway, yeah. If you want to get even more confused by that kind of stuff, then Heidegger Being in Time, but I definitely don't recommend that. I've got many problems with that book, but it's for me it's far too convoluted the way it's written. But I'm gonna have to go back and give it another sitting at some point, I imagine. But I've already been through it fairly well. There's things you can take from it. Anyway, off track here. So with the idea of self, like, well, it does bring into the question then, like, what is the self? Is the self the thing that has the authorship over the actions? And the guy was talking about, yeah, what's freely willed and determined. And again, we're getting into the whole free will issue, which again is another really problematic term, as well as the self. The reason why these terms are extremely problematic for many people, or just in discussions and debates, because people have different conceptions, and that's often talking about completely different things, and then they get angry when someone else says that their definition of something is wrong, and it's bedlam basically. Even in the cognitive neurosciences, there's they're very, because this is as an empirical a science as you can get regarding, as in empirical as in measurements, it's as good as you can get in terms of science. Even there, they're very, they're treading very lightly around certain concepts and terms, and they have got very rigid definitions. And yeah, funnily enough, someone who was just recently on a forum who's had certain strange, let's say strange, yeah, unusual, strange, not the norm experiences with his consciousness and sense of self and such, and speak and thinking. It's you do sort of need to take on board the technical jargon that's being used. Jargon is sometimes an unfriendly term. If you're talking about economics and specialized fields like that, and like in business talk, people just, it's used as a level as, wow, it's a bit of thunder. Yes, it's used at a certain level of pretension. Sign this. Oh, please sign this document. When I say just a piece of paper, sign a piece of paper, sign the form. So there is that kind of problem, but that doesn't, the scientific jargon and philosophical jargon, and even like psychological jargon, they're used to try and break through into a new sort of paradigm of thinking in certain ways, or it's a tool to think. It's a way to better articulate certain ideas and lay them out for other people to critique and falsify if need be. But it's a difficult problem. And yeah, with the whole free will, again, what I have found with free will, people tend to talk about determinism and free will, and I don't even think they're on the same axis at all. They're completely different things. And the reason I say this is, again, here we're skipping back into the kind of God concepts I was talking about previously, and the idea of one-upmanship and narratives beating each other. It's something I've been holding myself back from really jumping into this for a long time, but it's to do with antonyms and dichotomies. I've noticed, like, in the philosophical world in general, there's been a lot said and a lot of discussion about qualia and quanta, as in quanta, what can be measured, the qualia, which cannot be measured. It's a pure subjective feeling. And I found all too often there's a lack of recognition of certain antonyms which come into play. And this is where this is why I was interested in Hegel and why I want to read more about him in the future. Simply because of the idea of the synthesis. But I think he might have I think he might have, tried to run before he could walk, so to speak. And I mean this in terms of he's not really, well, maybe he has, I don't know, I've not read enough yet, but it's not been looked at intensely enough as how antonyms can operate between different people. And let me explain what I mean by this. There are three different types of antonyms, three in particular. There's four, there's auto-antonyms, but that's not relevant for this, or maybe it will be at some point. Ooh, I don't know if you can hear that. It's going to start raining pretty damn heavy. Actually, I think it's just passing us by. Anyway, I always forget which one's which, though. So there's relational antonyms. An example of this would be husband and wife. If there is a husband, there is a wife. You can't have one without the other. There's gradable antonyms, which is, hot and cold. If it's not hot, it can be warm. It's obviously what it says it is. It's gradable. And the other one is the one I always forget. Oh, forgive me. Let me just look it up a minute. I always forget the other one. Gradable. Gradable, relational, and where is it? Complementary. Or am I getting these muddled up? I probably am getting them muddled up. Yeah, complementary. Whereas one negates the other. That's how it's defined. And so an example of this would be alive and dead. If something is alive, it's not dead. If something's dead, it's not alive. So that's the complementary one. And the reason I'm bringing this up, so yeah, the gradable, there's a different level. Relational, you need to sort of have, if one exists, the other exists, that they come together. And the complementary, it's one or the other. Again, you can use this like with a door. A door, is it open or closed? It's one or the other. Again, you can always argue there's a certain point where there's a slight grey area there, but that's like, yeah, it's not really anything. A door is closed or it's open. Again, that gets more into the point of what we mean by saying open and closed with a door. Can it be like 0.5 millimeter open or not? That kind of thing. Anyway, so when it comes to free will and determinism, there we have a problem, or so I see it. Is free will an antonym of determinism? Is one opposite to the other? My view is no, it's not. And this is where, again, a large number of people struggle to understand compatibilism. So if you've ever struggled to understand compatibilism, that's basically what it's saying. Although for some reason I've never heard anyone sort of articulate in terms of antonyms why they can both exist. But so if we were to have free will, which basically means you're making choices, what term can we use which is appropriate here with that? the soul, the spirit, the self, the agent is probably the best way to put it. Let's go with some the neuroscientific way of looking at things. I'd say the agent. I am an agent. I decide on what actions I take. So the decision is there for me, and I am making the decision. The opposite to that is what would be it could there be a proper opposite to that term, an antonym to that term? Because a lot of people get confused with the opposite being negation. Like someone mentioned it to me recently, talking about Black Swan. What's his name? Someone Taleb Nassim or someone, and his idea of anti-fragile. Again, this is when I read it, and it's sort of someone I've seen a name around. It's like I'll have a look into it. When I looked it up, it's like, oh my god, yeah, that's the kind of thing that I like to look into. Because he says fragile, and like, fragile means it's easy to break. If you get it shipped somewhere, you put fragile on it so it doesn't get break. If you put non-fragile, then people just, treat it as normal. Whereas you're saying anti-fragile, as in the actual opposite, the dichotic opposite, the pure antonym of this thing, is what you want to do is, again, this could be gradable as well, though. You want to actually cause it stress, shake it around, smash it around. You're asking someone to do that, rather than fragile means the opposite. Don't do that. But people think not fragile is the opposite to fragile. Same with free will. If something is not freely willed or is not chosen, then it's not the opposite, it's the negation of. I do understand that there are lots of philosophers who talked about this kind of thing before, but I'm not sure I've not really seen it come up to the extent I would like in a lot of philosophy. I've seen lots of people playing around with this idea in terms of hermeneutics, and recently reading this guy, the guy I just showed you a picture of. I've seen him playing around this kind of idea and referring to other people too, but they're not saying what they're doing, they're just doing it. And ideas of negation, I see lots of people trying to flip things on the head, like, oh, violence is non-violence is violence and violence is not violence. It's this kind of Orwellian thing going on. But it's like people are sort of realizing there's something to be had here, there's something to be played with, something to be understood, but they're not quite always latching onto it as a universal thing we could do with many different concepts and terms. If you're following me. So yeah, well, determinism basically means things are set out causal and one action causes the next. That does not contradict free will, because it's just sort of saying that the thing which is making a choice makes the choice anyway. It chooses one way or other. Is it predetermined, like fatalism? That's a different prospect. Whereas I would say possibly the antonym to free will would be fatalism. Oh, here comes the thunder. It's getting further away now. But then if we're looking at determinism, what is the opposite to determinism? And again, people would just say, oh, non-determined. But non-determined is the negation of what would be anti-determined. Is there such a thing? So then we get to a point where it's like, well, how can we question this? Like, we can have yellow. Is there an anti-yellow? If there is not an anti-yellow, then what does yellow mean? Color and anti-color? We can have the absence of color, but we can't have the opposite of color. And as you start looking at a number of terms that we use, it becomes apparent that a lot of the time, a lot of what we say, we're not really fully aware of how accurate what we're saying is and how easy it is to misinform ourselves with the terms we're using. And it happens so easily. But again, the opposite to war would be peace. No, no, it's a negation of war, isn't it? What is the opposite to war? Or conflict. What is the opposite to conflict? And then you get the point, again, going back to this, the anti-fragile thing, it depends on where you're positioning your point of reference from. Because referring to like fragile and anti-fragile, you could say, oh, peace is the fragile state. Jesus. Peace is the fragile state. And therefore, the anti-peace state is war. Well, then what's the bit in the middle? What is the point there? But if you've got war, what is the opposite to war? Is the negation of war peace? If it's not, then what is it? And I think a lot of this plays into as well what I was, to reverse all the way back to what I was talking about authorship. And this is something which is particularly interesting in terms of how we perceive the world and self-perception and our attitudes towards optimism, pessimism, things like that. Because it has been shown empirically, measured accurately through the way we are wired, human brains are wired, we are overly optimistic. And what this means is, if, again, going back to this experiment where someone's placing their finger on the other, if we will adjust our beliefs based on evidence, always, but if the evidence is against what we would like it to be, we only adjust it a little bit. If it adjusts it towards something more favorable to us, we go straight to it. I might have mentioned this before, like in terms of cancer, like you say to some people, oh, what do you think the chances are of you getting cancer in your lifetime for the average human? Some people, oh, like 50% or like 20%, whatever. And then I tell them, oh, it's actually 90%. And they're like, oh, so the one that said 50%, they might go, oh, no, I still think it's about the same. Somebody's 20%, they might move up to 50. Again, they will edge towards it. Whereas if I told them, oh, no, your chance of getting cancer is 10%, actually. And they'd be like, oh, right, okay. And they would straight down to 10% because they don't want to get cancer. Well, assuming they don't want to get cancer, that is. So again, we've got this inbuilt kind of optimistic bias towards things. I guess you can see the flashes, can't you, from the lightning? If you can't hear it, then the microphone's working pretty well. Anyway, yeah, so there is that. And what's intriguing me is how this plays into the whole, in terms of what I was just saying with the war and the peace. Because like one, it seems easy to say like, oh, peace, the opposite to peace is, or the anti-peace would be war. It makes a bit more sense to say that. But then to say anti-war is peace, it doesn't seem like that. It seems like the negation of war. Was negation of peace, is that war? Not necessarily. It's just conflict, disagreement. It doesn't come up with war. And I don't know if you see what I mean, but there just seems to be a disjoint between these things. Yeah, and in terms of the whole idea of the God concepts, what I was talking about in the previous video, and this one-upmanship, where people are just re-articulating different ideas and stories, and they're slowly progressing one on top of the other. I feel like there's some sort of connection going on here. It's this kind of over-optimistic view. It's like we've got this slowly oscillating upwards. I can I can represent, referring back to something again we was just mentioning today, where I was a bit quick to answer someone. I was just like, oh my god, I just didn't want to get into the discussion of trying to discuss something that can't be discussed for obvious reasons. But there's a certain, and it's a case of is it delusion when you have a thought that you can't articulate? Because I've had these sort of thoughts before, and there where it's like, oh yeah, I know what I mean, but I don't know how to say it. And then sometimes I work my way around and I find a way to say it, and then I realize, oh no, it's just wrong. I was fooling myself, kidding myself. But other times it's like, oh yeah, I find a way to break through. I find the right concepts, and it's within this, within how we create our own thoughts, and um again, just referring back to what's his name, Byung Chul How was going about. Anyway, I maybe talk about that another time. Anyway, but yeah, he was sort of going on about contemplation, and is it Monty Pearly or Pearly Monty? I forgot his name. Morty. What's his goddamn name? Anyway, yeah, some phenomenologist guy, but just talking about contemplation, and this is what the guy was mentioning in his piece who was talked about online. He was going into this whole selfhood thing, talking about that, how it's like, yeah, in very instant decisions, like in the moment, they're kind of, arbitrary decisions. They're kind of predetermined of what's going to happen. I've always had this opinion, where there's something which is contemplative, where you're mulling it over, you're thinking about it, you're transposing it onto other ideas and fitting them around each other. This is something else. This is like, the short-term decision is not a decision, really. You could say it's kind of predetermined because you've already got the apparatus set up and your mindset set up. Whereas something which is a more of a long-term, you need to make a big exposition of it, sorry. Then you're playing around with ideas. Your ideas are changing and reforming as you move on. And then you are formulating ideas which create options and choices and paths to go down. And you're not doing it in a moment. You're doing it within the boredom, which I will refer to in the next piece of writing I do on Substack, where you're just kind of shutting down and you're just allowing ideas to sort of coalesce, and they kind of come about. But you can, this is the thing, I don't know, because trying to talk about the thoughts that are not worded is pretty difficult to do. And I always get the impression with these, it's more like, it's quite similar to making a piece of artwork. You have, this is why I got interested in aesthetics quite a lot. You have the idea of like a song. You can understand a song in one moment, but you have to hear the song over a period of time. And I think thoughts that are not worded are like this. The song is there. I have this, there's this architecture there which I can understand and I can see can be built in different ways. And I'm not, to say it's a choice, that's using a word. This is where I'm saying I will it into different directions, and it's not in the moment. It's always kind of happening. This is why I've used the word nascent quite a lot. It's this becoming which is going on. This is making less and less sense as I go on. I do realize that. Anyway, that's one bit of a ramble. So I'll leave it there, and I'll leave in the link to the piece of writing. Yeah, hopefully I don't know when, maybe in a week or two. Actually, what have I got to do? Yeah, a week or two or three. I say like within a month, I'm gonna try and get in touch with the guy, and we can do like a little conversation. And he has like an idea for how to deal with morality, which he bases on freedom. It's like, well, I'll let him explain it when we get round to it. Oh, anyway, bye bye. That's about it.